tears of the earth, in a land where the earth remembered more than men did, and where the sky grew heavy with silences too old to name. There lay a valley surrounded by mountains that folded like arms over a sleeping child. The people who lived there did not name their land, for they believed naming invited change, and they feared change as one fears the sudden cracking of still ice underfoot. The soil beneath their homes was dark and deep, the kind that remembered footsteps from centuries ago. It bore the weight of old stories, some sung and some wept, and all buried beneath layers of moss and time. Every seed planted in that ground seemed to whisper back the echoes of generations past, and every tree grew in crooked shapes, as if trying to speak in tongues of wind and leaf. But for 100 years now, no child had been born in the valley. No new laughter echoed across the ridges, and no tiny footprints danced between the patches of clover and lavender. The people lived, as if paused, aging gently, slowly, like stones under sun. They did not speak often of it, this stillness, but their eyes betrayed the longing that their mouths had long since forgotten how to shape. The last child born had been a girl named Luma. She had not cried when she came into the world. Instead, they said, she looked about the room with eyes the color of river-worn stones gray, with swirls of sorrow. Her mother, Alina, had whispered that the child had heard something in the womb that no child should hear, something the earth was saying in its sleep. They had listened for her cry. It never came. Instead, on the day she was born, the sky wept. Rain so thick and endless it flooded even the corners of the valley that had never known water. Streams overflowed, stones rolled like fruit down the hills, the trees bent as if bowing to a grief they did not understand. The villagers took it as a sign. Some called her cursed, others called her chosen. But no one denied that something old and wounded had stirred awake in the deep roots of their land, and that it had spoken through the birth of the silent girl. Luma grew like a vine and shade thin, quiet, watchful. Her hair was black as wet bark, and her skin was pale like the soft underleaf of the elder trees. She did not speak, but she sang in a voice that seemed to bypass the air and go straight into the soil. It was not a song made of words. It was a hum, a tone, a resonance that made birds fall quiet and leaves quiver. The people did not teach her. They watched her, and from her silence, learned to listen again. She would walk the old paths barefoot, pausing often to place her hand on stones or dip her fingers into the cold mouths of springs. She touched bark like it was skin. She stared at clouds as if they carried letters meant only for her, and always. The land responded. The grass where she sat would grow greener. Animals came closer. The wind, usually a shy and stumbling guest, found itself curling gently around her shoulders. And though the valley never bore another child, it felt somehow that something ancient and essential was being healed. Yet something deeper remained wounded, because though the earth stirred under Luma's feet, it did not rejoice. It murmured, it sighed, it remembered, and what it remembered was grief. One day, when Luma was in her 20th winter, a crack appeared in the cliffside that looked over the eastern field. It was narrow, barely more than a wound in the stone, but the sound that came from it was unmistakable. A low, constant moan. Like wind caught inside a throat of rock, the villagers gathered. Old men touched their foreheads to the earth. Mothers clutched amulets made from elderwood and dried river leaf. They remembered stories whispered during the long winter stales of the earth's core, a place not of fire but of memory, where every sorrow ever buried found a home. They said that when the earth grew too full of tears, it would open a mouth and cry out. This was the mouth, and it was weeping. Luma stood at the edge of the crack, her hair fluttering around her like a slow shadow. She listened, not with her ears, but with her body, with her breath. With the bottom of her feet, she turned and looked at the people not above or below them. But through them and, though she did not speak, they heard her voice in their minds. It remembers. She stepped into the crack. The elders tried to stop her. Hands reached out, cries filled the air, but Luma was already inside the stone. The earth opened wider around her as if recognizing one of its own, swallowing her form gently, like water taking back a tear. The villagers wept. but there was no sound of her falling, only a stillness. And then, after a long breath of silence, low, pulsing note began to rise from the fissure. It was not mournful, not yet joyful, but it was different than before. It was listening, inside the earth. Luma walked corridors made not of carved stone, but of shaped memory. The walls pulsed with old colors, deep blues of forgotten oceans, golds from shattered suns, reds like the first blood spilled on soil. The deeper she went, the warmer it grew, but not in the way of fire, in the way of heartbeats, in the way of sorrow held close. She passed chambers filled with echoes. She heard names she had never learned but somehow knew. She heard a lullaby sung by a mother who had lost her son to war. She heard the laughter of a girl who had buried her dog beneath an apple tree and cried for 3 seasons straight. She heard the rumble of landslides and the hush of snow burying entire villages in white sleep. She understood then. The earth wept, not because of what was done to it, but because it had witnessed every tear shed upon it and could no longer carry the weight in silence. It needed someone to listen, not to fix, not to mend, but to understand. And so Luma walked for what felt like lifetimes. She walked through memory, through sorrow, through stories no longer told, through forests burned and reborn, through rivers dried and recarved, through the bones of creatures whose names had never passed human lips. And in each place, she placed her hand on the walls and whispered not words, but presence. She let the earth know, "I hear you," and slowly the color returned, not the bright greens of spring, but the deep, fertile browns of soil that has known fire and grown kinder because of it. Above ground, the villagers began to feel it. Birds returned to trees, long silent. The river that had shrunk to a ribbon began to swell. With glacial clarity, the fruit tasted fuller. The sky seemed to sigh less. They did not know what Luma was doing, but they felt her, and they waited years. Past the crack did not close, but from it came a soft glow, at night gold and soft as honey. The people called it Luma's light. They no longer mourned her. They spoke to the crack as they would to a well or a holy tree. They told it their sorrows. And though no voice answered, they always left lighter, and sometimes, just sometimes, when the moon was low and the wind still, they heard a hum rising from the depths, a hum like a song with no beginning, a song of tears understood, a song the earth had waited centuries to sing. Seasons circled the valley like an old chant. Winter laid her hush across the stones, then stepped aside for spring, who wandered in with wet feet and the smell of thawed pine. The villagers learned again to move slowly, to breathe with the rhythm of roots rather than the ticking of clocks. There were no more births, but there was no more fear either. The people lived not in waiting, but in presence. They planted gardens, not just for harvest, but for the joy of watching things grow. They told their stories to trees. They stopped cutting the elderwoods for fire, and instead burned sage and rain-dried brush, as if trying to send messages upward into the cloud-heavy sky. In the crack in the cliff, Luma's gate became a place of pilgrimage. Not for the world outside. No traveler stumbled upon the valley. It remained hidden, wrapped in mist and moss, in the collective memory of its people. But those within would take turns walking to the fissure at dusk. They would kneel, place their hands on the rim of stone and whisper into the glow. Some spoke of lost loves, others of the quiet ache of growing old. Still others simply said thank you. The earth listened, and deep beneath where Luma wandered, the song of memory continued. But memory, like river water, does not flow in one direction. Luma had walked through grief, through sorrow, fossilized into sound and color. But now, something else began to rise from the roots of the world, a remembrance not of pain, but of joy. It came first as a single note, soft, round, like the first heartbeat of a newborn calf, then another clearer, higher, laughing, and then a swell, like rain returning to dry hills. Like bells in an unseen steeple, Luma stood in a wide cavern, lit not by flame, but by a bioluminescence that pulsed from the walls like breath. Vines hung like threads of memory, thick with golden droplets. that dripped sound instead of liquid. And when the droplets touched the ground, flowers bloomed, brief, radiant, vanishing again into glow. This was the heart root, the oldest chamber of the earth's remembering. Here were kept not only wounds, but wonder. Luma stepped forward, and the air shifted around her as if it recognized her footsteps. The chamber sang, not in words, not in voices, but in pure, unburdened joy. She saw moments the first time a deer stood on trembling legs, exact second to lovers kissed under a rainstorm. The bloom of laughter from a boy who had caught his first fish and let it go again. Here were memories the earth had held sacred, not because they were rare, but because they were shared, because they meant something to more than one. And Luma understood then. Sorrow was heavy not because it hurt, because it so often felt alone. But joy, even fleeting, even fragile, multiplied itself through connection. She sat in the heart root for 7 days. She listened, wept, not from grief, but from beauty. Then she began to hum again, but now her hum was different. It carried not just the earth's sorrow, but its hope, not just its pain, but its pride. The notes echoed upward, touching layers of stone, soil, root, and seed and above in the valley. Something began to shift. A tree long thought dead began to bloom, just one branch. But it was enough to call the bees. A woman with a limp since childhood stood from her chair without thinking and walked. A boy, born with no words, spoke his first one, light. And the river, which had flowed steady but slow, began to dance. The villagers did not question. They felt her return not as a body, but as a presence. And in time, the children returned too. The first was born in the spring of the 21st year after Luma's descent. Her name was Miran. She cried at birth not in fear, but in song. Every note of her first cry matched the hum that rose from the cliff. The people wept and laughed. They gathered in the fields and planted wildflowers with no purpose, but beauty. They told Miran the stories of the one who had gone below, who had listened when the world was weeping, and taught it how to remember joy. Miran grew quickly and often wandered to the edge of the fissure. She never fell. She never feared. She would sit there for hours, humming softly, eyes closed, hand pressed to the stone. She said the stones told her stories. She said the earth was still singing, and each year, more children came. Not many, not suddenly, but enough. Enough to echo laughter through the ridges again. Enough to chase foxes through the clover and weave stories from clouds. Enough to learn the old ways of listening, of planting, of pausing. They called themselves the listeners. They knew that the world was not a thing to conquer, but a song to join. And Luma? She remained below, not buried, not gone, but rooted. Her hum had become the rhythm of the valley's seasons, the quiet between raindrops, the hush before snow. And sometimes if you knelt close enough to the ground and placed your ear to the soil, you could hear her, still listening, still singing, still holding the tears of the earth, like seeds in her palm, waiting for the right moment to bloom them into stars. The years moved like rivers, never the same water, never the same shape, but always forward. Miran grew into a girl with soil beneath her fingernails and stars in her gaze. She had the laughter of someone who had never feared the dark, and the calm of someone who understood it. Where other children played in meadows, she wandered the edges of the forest, whispering to trunks, tracing her fingers across bark as if reading braille left by the wind. She never spoke of Luma as legend. She called her mother of memory, not mother by blood, but by bond, by echo. Miran knew that the world had wept long before humans ever stood upright, and would weep long after. But she also believed in something greater than grief, in renewal, in cycles, in the breath between endings and beginnings. Sometimes, she would sit at the mouth of the crack, the place others called sacred, and sing softly. Her songs were different from Luma's. They held no sorrow. They were lullabies of the now. Songs that welcomed birds, coaxed sprouts, healed bees. It was said the sky lingered longer when she sang, that clouds refused to pass too quickly, and Sunlight took its time softening the grass, and deep below, Luma listened. The heartroot had grown, not in size, but in reach. It pulsed now in places far beyond the valley and distant forests, where old trees leaned close together. In deserts where stones stood upright like forgotten altars, in oceans where whales cried echoes older than the moon, wherever. The earth was honored. The hum could be heard faintly, like a dream half-remembered. Like a song one once knew in childhood, people began to return to those places. Not as pilgrims, not prophets, just people, broken, hopeful, needing to listen. They knelt in red dust. They leaned against trembling trees. They pressed hands to cliff faces, and the earth went silent. Once wounded answered softly, not in words, but in warmth, in wind that smelled like rain, in butterflies landing where no flowers had grown in years, in tears that no longer burned. Back in the valley, the children grew into keepers. Some planted, some painted, some simply sat with the dying and made the silence sacred again. But always, they listened. And as they listened, the land healed. Not perfectly, not quickly, but deeply. The cliff's mouth remained open, not as a wound, but as a well from it. Golden mist would sometimes rise at dawn. The elders said it was memory exhaled. Children said it was Luma's breath. One evening, Mira, now a young woman, stood at its edge. Her hair was wild with wind, her fingers stained with burying clay. She looked down, and for the first time she heard not just the hum, but words, not spoken, not heard, known. The earth remembers not only pain, but promise. She stepped back, and in that moment, the cliff shivered and began, ever so slowly. Too close, not to seal away, but to complete. The people gathered, watching in silence. No one cried, no one called out. They simply placed their palms to the ground, whispered their thanks. Mirren did not weep. She smiled, because she understood now that Luma was not below. She was within. The cliff closed, and the mist rose one last. Time thick, golden radiant. It drifted across the valley, seeping into trees, into roots, into the folds of clothing and hair and skin. And when it touched the hearts of the people, they felt something change. A stillness, a settling, a knowing. The soil beneath them held them. Like arms, the wind welcomed them like kin, and deep in the marrow of the world, something exhaled. Not a goodbye, but a release. A return. And from that day on, the valley sang. Not aloud, not always, but in the way fireflies blink in patterns only the trees understand, in the way rain dances on roofs at night, like fingertips on drum skin, in the way children breathe when they sleep, safe and full of dreams. They say now that if you lie flat in the fields, with your eyes closed and your heart open, you can feel it, the THRUM, the hum, the heartbeat of a healed wound, the lullaby, the land, the tears of the earth not forgotten but transformed, not buried but planted, and everywhere. Slowly, silently, something begins to bloom. There was no monument to Luma in the valley, no statue, no shrine, no inscription carved in stone, but everything grew in her memory. The children named trees after her laughter. They built circular gardens, spiraling inward like the path she took into the heart of the earth. Every year, on the day the cliff first opened, they held no festival, only silence. From sunrise to moonrise, the valley breathed without words, in honor of the one who listened before all others did. In that silence, flowers bloomed louder than trumpets. Leaves turned with a whisper of reverence. The wind wandered the valley, not as a guest, but as kin, and deep in the soil, memory stirred gently, ever gone. Just dreaming, as decades passed, the story of Luma changed. Not in essence, but in shape. Some said she was part tree now. Others claimed she had become a note in the earth's song. Still others believed she walked the roots of every forest. Unseen, but always felt. Mirren grew older. her hair silvered like frost clinging to pine needles. But her eyes remained, young clear pools of understanding, deep with what she had seen, what she had sung, and what she still carried. She had no children of her own, but the valley was her child. Every stone, every petal, every heartbeat among the trees hers. She became a teacher of silence. She taught the new ones how to hear what had no voice, how to see what did not wish to be known, how to speak only when speaking added something true to the soil. When she finally lay down beneath the bloom tree in the northern field, wrapped in woven grass and held by hands she had taught to heal, the stars gathered low. No one spoke. Not a single tear fell, because her leaving was not an ending. It was an unfolding. The villagers planted 1,000 seeds in her name. They did not mark the grave. Instead, they sang the hum she had inherited from Luma, a song with no beginning, no end, just the breath of the world made tender, and all across the valley. The earth trembled not in sorrow, but in joy, because it was no longer alone. It had companions. Now it had listeners far beyond the valley, where deserts met. Dusk and mountains kept watch over clouds. Others began to feel it too. In places once barren, trees returned tiny at first, fragile as hope. Rivers that had long since run dry began to flow, fed not by rain, but by memory. And those who walked these lands felt it in their bones, an ache, peace, call. They followed it. They came to quiet places. They knelt. They placed hands to ground, and they listened. Many of them never spoke again, not out of trauma, but reverence. They had heard something truer than language, something older than belief. They called themselves seed bearers, and wherever they walked, life followed, not loud, not swift, but real. Permanent, 1,000 years later, the valley was still hidden. Maps didn't show it. Roads didn't reach it. But those who needed it always found their way. They came lost and left rooted. No one taught them. No one led them. They simply walked among the trees, placed their palms to the stones, and let the silence do its work. The soil remembered every footstep. The wind cradled every sigh, and deep below, the heartroot pulsed, now vast, now wild, now connected to every place that had been healed by listening. Luma was everywhere, now not in name, not in form, but in presence. She was the soft place between pain and peace, the hush before forgiveness, the moment when tears no longer mean breaking, but blooming in time. Even the oldest language faded, but the hum remained. It passed from wind to river, from leaf to loam, from child to child. It echoed not in sound, but in rhythm, the rhythm of stillness, the rhythm of growth, the rhythm of earth, no longer bearing sorrow alone. And in some quiet future, when the world had changed beyond names and nations, there would still be one place, just one, where a child would lie down in the grass, close their eyes, press an ear to the ground, hear the song of all things, the song of what was once wounded, now whole, the song that Luma sang without words, the song the earth still sings. Remember, I carry, I bloom. These are the tears of the earth, not lost, not wasted, but planted and rising and eternal.